The blood on the snow was long gone, but Jacob Brunin saw it every time he closed his eyes. Not his wife's blood. The fever that took Sarah was a thief in the night, invisible and clean. It left nothing behind but a hollowed-out man in a hollowed-out cabin. He was 38 years old and felt a century older. The Montana mountains outside his window were like broken teeth chewing on a bruised gray sky. Everything was dead, or dying, and Jacob was content to join it. The trapline needed checking. The woodpile was shrinking. But his feet felt nailed to the floor. The cabin wasn't a home anymore. It was a tomb with a leaky roof. He finally pulled on his coat, the one Sarah had mended. Her stitches on the shoulder were still perfect, stronger than she had been. The thought didn't even sting anymore. It was just a fact. The cold hit him like a fist. His boots crunched in the deep snow. He walked his 3-mile line by memory alone, his mind a silent, frozen landscape. The first 5 traps were empty. The 6th held a pine marten, frozen solid. He'd waited too long. He reset it without a flicker of feeling. The sun was already bleeding out by the time he turned for home. The dark came fast in these parts. He followed his own tracks back, a ghost haunting himself. He was 50 yards from the cabin when he stopped dead. There were other tracks, fresh ones, small, bare feet, stumbling, desperate. They came out of the tree line and went straight for his cabin, straight for his door. His hand went to the rifle on his back, a reflex from a life he'd mostly forgotten. His heart, a dead thing in his chest for months, gave a sudden hard thump. He crept forward, the snow groaning under his weight. He put his ear to the door. Silence. He tried the handle, unlocked. He never locked it. Who was there to steal from a dead man? He nudged the door open with his rifle barrel. The inside was as cold and dark as a crypt. And there, on the floor by the dead hearth, was a body. A girl curled into a ball. Her skin was the color of copper. Her hair was a black river matted with ice. She wore a deerskin dress, torn and thin. Her feet were bare and bloody. She wasn't moving. Jacob stood there, the freezing air burning his lungs. A crow girl, by the beads on her dress, maybe 20, alone, dying on his floor. He should shut the door. He should walk away. This wasn't his fight. Getting involved with the tribes was asking for trouble he didn't want. He had enough ghosts. He didn't need new ones. But his feet moved. He knelt beside her, his rifle leaning against the wall. Her skin was ice. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching. Nothing. He searched again, harder. There. A pulse. Faint, thready, a tiny bird fluttering against the cage of death. But it was there. She was alive. And that's when his training kicked in, the instincts he thought he'd buried years ago. He wasn't just a trapper anymore. He was something else. Something he'd run from. He worked fast, his mind clear for the first time in months. He built the fire until it roared, a beast against the cold. He melted snow for water. He pulled every blanket he owned and wrapped her tight, shocked at how light she was. A bundle of twigs. As the warmth filled the cabin, he saw the details. The cuts on her feet weren't from walking. They were too clean, too straight. And her dress wasn't just torn. The edges of the fabric were blackened, brittle, singed. Her hands were bruised, her knuckles split. She'd been fighting, or she'd been bound. He cleaned her feet, his touch gentle. Her face in the firelight was sharp and beautiful, even with lips cracked and bleeding. She was nothing like Sarah, but the stillness of her, the helplessness, it reminded him of the end. He wouldn't just wait this time. He couldn't. He made a weak broth and tried to spoon it between her lips. Most of it ran down her chin. He didn't stop. Through the night, he was a machine. Check her pulse. Add wood to the fire. Try the broth again. Just before dawn, the world outside vanished. A blizzard hit, a wall of white fury. The wind screamed like a banshee. Jacob was grateful. Whatever she was running from couldn't track her now. They were sealed in. She woke on the 2nd day. Her eyes snapped open, dark and full of terror. She tried to scramble up, a wild animal in a trap. A strangled cry tore from her throat. Jacob, who'd been dozing in his chair, was instantly awake. He held up his hands, slow, palms out. "Easy," he said, his voice a rusty croak. He hadn't spoken in 2 months. She stared, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking everything in. The rifle, the door, him. She was weak, but she was calculating. A survivor. He pointed to himself. "Jacob." She said nothing. He pointed to the fire, the blankets, the bowl of broth. He mimed eating, then pointed to her. An offer. Her eyes held his for a long, tense moment. Then, with a tiny, almost invisible movement, she nodded. He brought her the bowl, keeping a careful distance. She took it with hands that shook so badly she almost spilled it. She didn't sip. She drank like a wolf, desperate and fast. When it was gone, she looked at him again. The fear was still there, but something else was creeping in. A question. He refilled the bowl. As the storm raged, they existed in a silent truce. He would tend the fire. She would sleep. He would bring food. She would watch him, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the second chair at the table. She saw the woman's coat still hanging by the door. Her gaze lingered on the small, silver-backed mirror on the wall, a ghost of a life that was over. When her eyes met his again, he saw she understood. He was alone, too. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it broke, she was strong enough to stand, her bandaged feet taking her weight with a wince. She started helping in small ways, folding the blankets he'd used on her. She wouldn't be a burden. On the 4th day, the sun came out, sharp and blinding on the new snow. The world was clean and deadly. Jacob stood at the window, knowing this was it. She was strong enough to travel. She would leave. She would go back to her people, and he would go back to his silence. The thought felt like swallowing glass. He turned, and she was watching him. She stood by the fire, wrapped in one of his wool blankets. She did something that shocked him. She pointed a finger at her own chest. Ayita. A name. She was giving him her name. Something cracked in Jacob's frozen heart. He nodded, repeating it. Ayita. He tried to get the sound right. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. And for now, that was more than enough. They started to talk, but not with words. She taught him her people's signs, her hands painting stories in the air. He was clumsy, his fingers thick and slow, but she was patient. He learned her story, piece by agonizing piece. Her village of Crow people had been attacked, not by soldiers, not by another tribe, by white men. They came at night, with fire. She made the signs for screaming, for running, for family, followed by the sharp final sign for gone. There was no home to go back to. He understood that better than he cared to admit. He told her about Sarah, using the clumsy signs for love, sickness, and the great silent emptiness. She watched, and he saw in her dark eyes a mirror of his own loss. They were 2 ghosts, haunting the same small cabin. January came, and the cabin started to change. It wasn't a tomb anymore. Ayita filled it with quiet purpose. She took the frozen pelts from his traps and tanned them with a skill he'd never had, using tools she fashioned from bone and stone. She cooked with wild herbs she found, plants he'd never even noticed. She made a salve for his hands, cracked and bleeding from the cold and the work. In 3 days they were healed. The silence between them became comfortable. He started reading to her at night from his few books. She couldn't understand the words, but she'd watch his face, listening to the rise and fall of his voice, understanding the emotion behind the sounds. But Jacob knew this couldn't last. A white man and a Crow woman, living together? It was a death sentence. When the snows melted, the world would come for them. Questions would be asked, vicious, ugly questions, and the answers would get them both killed. The thought of her leaving was a physical pain, a tearing deep inside him. He hadn't realized how much he'd come to depend on the simple sound of her breathing in the quiet cabin. One afternoon, a brief thaw melted the snow on the roof. Jacob spent the day clearing the heavy slush, Ayita watching from below, ready to warn him if he slipped. That night, she made a stew. The taste was so familiar, it stunned him. It tasted like his mother's stew. From a life so long ago, it felt like a dream. How could she have known? He looked up from his bowl, and she was watching him, a question in her eyes. He nodded, his throat too thick to speak, and then she smiled. A real, brilliant smile. It lit up her whole face. It made him remember she was just a girl, really, 20 years old, and he was almost 40, a man worn down to the bone by grief. The gap between them should have been a canyon, but in the warm glow of the firelight, it felt like nothing at all. That night, Jacob made a choice. He went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed. Inside were Sarah's things. He hadn't opened it since she died. He reached past her dress, past her letters. He pulled out a shawl. Soft wool, dyed a deep, midnight blue. Sarah had loved it. He walked back to the fire and held it out to Aida. An offering, a message he had no signs for. She looked at the shawl, then at him. Her eyes were wide. She understood. She knew this belonged to the ghost in the cabin. She slowly reached out and took it. She draped it over her shoulders, the deep blue stark against her copper skin. She pulled it tight and looked up at him. Her eyes were shining with tears. So were his. Something had passed between them, something real, and neither of them wanted to let it go. March came, and the world outside began to wake up. They worked side by side, patching the roof, chinking the logs. She was making the cabin stronger, her home. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building. The line between them blurred. She no longer slept by the fire, but on a pallet of furs at the foot of his bed. He'd lie awake, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, a sound that had become as necessary as his own heartbeat. One evening, she told him a new story with her hands, about her grandmother, a healer who had taught her everything about the earth. When she finished, she looked at him, her face full of a sorrow so deep it took his breath away. She made a new sign, one he hadn't seen. She made it again, slowly. The sign meant, "I am lost." He reached out and covered her hand with his. She didn't pull away. "You're not lost," he whispered, the words rough. "You're here." She looked from their joined hands to his face, and she understood. She didn't move away from the fire that night. When he lay down on his bed, she lay down beside him. Not touching, just close. Close enough to share the warmth. Close enough that for the first time since October, Jacob did not feel alone. The next morning, everything was different. When she handed him his coffee, their fingers brushed. She held his gaze for a moment before looking away. That afternoon, while fetching water from the creek, he saw them. Boot prints. At least 2 men. They hadn't come to the cabin, just passed nearby. Trappers, probably. But they were a reminder. The world was coming back. Their isolation was ending. He didn't mention the tracks. But that night, Aida was quiet, staring into the flames. Finally, she turned to him. Her hands moved, slow and deliberate. What happens when summer comes? It was the question he'd been dreading. He couldn't ask her to stay. To live in hiding, always looking over her shoulder. It wasn't a life. But letting her go. That was unthinkable. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark forest. He turned back to her, the firelight catching the hope and fear in her eyes. He said the only word he could. "Stay." She rose and came to him, her eyes searching his face. She reached up and touched his cheek, her hand warm against his cold skin. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it there. She leaned in, so close he could feel her breath. So close that when her lips met his, it felt less like a choice and more like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened into something desperate and true. They were 2 survivors clinging to a life raft in a storm. They broke apart, breathing hard. There was still a question in her eyes. Was he sure? He was. He took her hand and led her to the bed. After, they lay tangled in the blankets, listening to a late spring snow fall outside. And for the first time in a very long time, Jacob felt something like peace. But he didn't know the peace was a lie. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming for them. April exploded into life. The world turned green, and inside the cabin, something was changing too. Jacob found himself laughing. The sound was so strange he stopped, startled. Aita just smiled and did the funny thing with the sticks again, making him laugh harder. But their newfound happiness was a fragile thing. One day, Jacob had to ride to Fort Benton for supplies. He hated leaving her, but they needed flour and salt. The fort was a chaotic mess of trappers, soldiers, and prospectors drunk on gold fever. He was loading his horse when he overheard two men talking. "Heard they finally found one of them Crow survivors," one said. "The girl from that village massacre back in the fall." Jacob's blood ran cold. He kept his back to them, his hands busy with a leather strap. "Yeah? What did they do with her?" "Took her to the territorial agent. Word is, she wasn't just any survivor. She was the chief's daughter. And she saw the whole thing. Saw the men who did it." The second man spat. "What men? I thought it was the Lakota." "That's the official story. This girl, she's saying different. She's saying it was white men, led by a fella named Silas Kane." Jacob's hands froze. Silas Kane, a name from his past, a name he thought he'd left buried under a landslide of bad memories and blood. A ruthless land baron he'd once crossed when he wore a badge. A man who never forgot a grudge. Kane? He's a big man in this territory. No one's gonna believe some Indian girl over him. Maybe not. But the agent has to investigate. Sent a patrol out to Kane's main camp to ask some questions. They found the camp burned to the ground, everyone dead. And the girl, she's gone. Vanished from the agent's custody. Jacob felt a cold dread snake up his spine. He finished his packing in a blur, his mind racing. He pushed his horse hard, the 2-day trip turning into a frantic day-and-a-half ride. He had to get back. He had to know. He burst into the clearing and saw the cabin. It was still standing. A wave of relief washed over him. Then he saw the front door. It was splintered, hanging off one hinge. He leaped from his horse, rifle in hand. "Aita!" The cabin was a wreck. The table was overturned, their meager supplies scattered, but she wasn't there. He searched the area, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found tracks behind the cabin, her tracks, running for the woods, and other tracks. 2 men, in heavy boots. They had her. Silas Kane had her. He followed the tracks, his past life as a lawman taking over. He moved fast and silent through the forest, reading the signs. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were arrogant. They thought they were safe. He found their camp at dusk. 2 men, laughing around a fire. And Aita, tied to a tree, her face bruised but defiant. She saw him in the shadows and her eyes widened, but she didn't make a sound. She was a survivor. She knew how to wait for her moment. One of the men was talking. "Kane's gonna be real happy we found her. Said she's the only one who can finger him for that village raid. And she knows where the old chief hid the map." Map? What map? Jacob didn't care. He only cared about the woman tied to the tree. He waited until the sky was pitch black. He circled the camp, a ghost in the trees. He picked up a rock and threw it hard into the brush on the opposite side of the clearing. "What was that?" one of the men said, grabbing his rifle. "Probably just a deer. Relax. I'm gonna check it out." It was the mistake Jacob was waiting for. When the first man was 20 yards from the fire, Jacob moved. He came up behind the second man, a shadow among shadows, a knife to the throat. It was silent, brutal, and quick. The first man heard the gurgle and turned. "Hey, what?" Jacob was already moving. He fired his rifle from the hip. The man crumpled. He ran to Aita, cutting her ropes. Her arms went around his neck, and she held on tight. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here," he said. "I'm here." But they both knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Silas Kane knew she was alive. And now he'd know she had help. Aida pulled back, her eyes dark with a truth she'd been holding back. She reached into the tattered lining of her dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of oiled leather. She unfolded it. It was a map. Drawn in charcoal were mountains and rivers he didn't recognize. "My father gave this to me," she signed, her hands moving quickly. "Before they came. He told me to run, to protect it." "What does it lead to?" Jacob asked. Her signs were clear and terrible. Not gold. Justice. It was a map to a hidden ledger. Her father, the chief, had been smart. He'd known men like Cain couldn't be trusted. For years, he had secretly documented every broken treaty, every illegal land grab, every crime Cain and his political allies had committed in the territory. The ledger was proof, enough to hang them all, and it was hidden deep in the unforgiving mountains marked on the map. "He'll never stop hunting you," Jacob said. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "Then we don't run. We fight." Jacob looked at the map, then at the determined woman before him. His old life, the one he had tried so desperately to bury, had found him. He could run again, try to disappear with her. Or he could stand and fight. For her. For the life they had just started to build. It wasn't a choice at all. "All right," he said, his voice grim. "Let's go get that ledger." They traveled for weeks, pushing deeper into the mountains than Jacob had ever been before. They were not just travelers anymore. They were prey. Every shadow could be one of Cain's men. Every strange sound in the night made them jump. They moved fast, Aita navigating with the map and her innate knowledge of the wilderness. She was in her element here, strong and capable. She taught Jacob how to move without a sound, how to read the birds for warnings, which plants could hide their scent. He, in turn, taught her how to handle a pistol, his old Colt feeling strangely familiar in his hand. The bond between them deepened, forged in shared danger. Nights were spent huddled together for warmth and comfort, whispering plans in the darkness. They were a team, two broken people made whole by a shared purpose. One evening, they were camped in a high canyon when they heard the baying of hounds. "He's got trackers," Jacob said, his face grim. "We can't outrun them." Aida looked around, her eyes scanning the rocky canyon walls. She pointed to a narrow, rushing river at the bottom of the gorge. "We can lose our scent in the water." It was a desperate gamble. The water was icy, the current strong. But they had no choice. They scrambled down the steep slope, the barking of the dogs getting closer. They plunged into the freezing river, the shock of the cold stealing their breath. The current grabbed them, pulling them downstream into the darkness. They were swept for miles, battered against rocks, half drowned. Finally, Jacob managed to grab an overhanging branch and pull them both to the bank, where they collapsed, shivering and exhausted. They had escaped, but they had lost their horses and most of their supplies. All they had left were their weapons, the clothes on their backs, and the precious map, which Aita had kept safe in its leather pouch. They were alone, on foot, in the heart of the wilderness. And Silas Cain was still behind them. The next few days were a blur of hunger and exhaustion. They ate roots and berries Aida could identify. They slept in caves. Jacob's leg was badly bruised from the river, and he was slowing them down. "You should go on without me," he told her one night, his voice strained with pain. "You're faster alone." She looked at him, her expression fierce in the moonlight. She shook her head, her hands making sharp, angry signs. Together, or not at all. Her loyalty was a fire in his soul. He would not fail her. They finally found the landmark from the map, a rock formation shaped like a sleeping giant. According to the map, the ledger was hidden in a cave behind a waterfall nearby. They found the waterfall, a thundering curtain of white water cascading down a sheer cliff. The cave was behind it, just as the map promised. It was dark and damp. In the back, under a pile of loose rocks, was a heavy, iron-bound box. Jacob pried it open with his knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound book. The ledger. He opened it. Page after page was filled with her father's elegant script, detailing dates, names, and crimes. It was all there. A meticulous record of Silas Kane's reign of terror. "We have it," Jacob breathed. But their relief was short-lived. As they stepped out from behind the waterfall, they walked straight into an ambush. Silas Kane stood there, a cruel smile on his face. He was flanked by half a dozen of his men. "I knew you'd lead me right to it, Jacob," Kane sneered. "Always so predictable. And you," he said, his eyes landing on Aita. "You've caused me more trouble than you're worth." "It's over, Kane," Jacob said, his hand moving slowly toward his pistol. "It is," Kane agreed. "For you." Gunshots exploded in the narrow canyon. Jacob shoved Aita behind him, firing back, his old instinct screaming to life. Men fell, but there were too many. A bullet tore through Jacob's shoulder, sending a shock of white-hot pain through him. He stumbled back, his vision blurring. Kane's men were closing in. This was it. They were trapped. Suddenly, a war cry echoed from the cliffs above. A dozen Crow warriors appeared on the ridge, bows drawn. Arrows rained down on Kane's men with silent, deadly accuracy. Aita stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. She made a sign, a name. "Kills the night." A warrior, older than the rest, leaped down from the rocks, a tomahawk in his hand. He moved with the grace of a panther, cutting through Kane's remaining men. "My uncle," Aita whispered to Jacob. "I thought he was dead." It turned out, a small band of warriors from her village had been on a hunt when the massacre happened. They had returned to find the devastation and had been tracking Kane's men ever since, looking for any sign of survivors. They had found their trail days ago. Now, only Silas Kane was left. He stood back to back with Jacob's old nemesis, a man whose face was a mask of fury. Jacob, despite his wound, stood his ground, facing the man who had destroyed Aita's life and dragged him back into the violence he'd tried to escape. The final fight was brutal. Jacob, fueled by love and a desperate need for redemption, fought with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. He disarmed Kane, their struggle ending with Jacob's knife at the Baron's throat. Kane looked at him, his eyes full of shock and hatred. "You were always a coward, Jacob, hiding in the mountains." "I was," Jacob said, his voice cold as stone. "But you found me." "He didn't kill him. Instead, he bound him tightly. Justice was for the law, not for him." Aita's uncle, Kills the Night, nodded at Jacob, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He and his warriors took Kane and the ledger. They would see it delivered to the federal authorities. They would see justice done for their people. Aita rushed to Jacob's side, tearing a strip from her dress to bind his wound. "You stayed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I told you I would," he said, his head slumping against her. They had won. In the end, the ledger did its work. Silas Kane and his powerful friends were exposed. The territory was thrown into chaos as the scandal erupted. But for Aita's people, it was the beginning of justice. The land that had been stolen was eventually returned. Jacob and Aita didn't stay to see it. They had found what they were looking for, and it wasn't in a courtroom or a newspaper. They traveled with Kills the Night and his warriors to a hidden valley, a place of peace her people had kept secret for generations. It was there they finally built their home. A real home, built of hope instead of survival. Jacob never wore a badge again, but he was no longer a ghost. He was a husband, and soon, a father. Aita, no longer a lone survivor, became a leader, helping her people rebuild. One evening, as the sun set over their peaceful valley, Jacob sat on the porch of their new cabin, holding his infant daughter. She had his eyes and her mother's fierce spirit. Aita came and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Happy?" she asked softly. He looked at the woman who had saved him, at the child who was their future, at the home they had built from the ashes of their pasts. "Yes," he said, "I am happy." They had faced the darkest winter imaginable and walked out into the spring. They proved that even after the most devastating loss, life can find a way to bloom again, stronger and more beautiful than before. What do you think? Can love truly heal all wounds? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival and redemption.